of globalist power grab, essentially, which what it seems to me is potentially extremely damaging, not just on the country level, but also from the level of a functioning society. So that was really why I decided to speak up.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. It's quite unusual, though, to find someone in the medical profession that is prepared to speak so blunt. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome today Jonathan Gilthorpe, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Integrative Medical Biology at Umeå University in Sweden. And the main point of today's discussion is to talk about the new WHO Pandemic Preparedness Treaty. And Jonathan provided some verbal evidence at the consultation process, but you're only given a 2-minute window, which really isn't enough to go through a very important issue. And the point of today is if we can go through some ideas about what could usefully be centralized at the WHO and what really should stay in country and be the prerogative of the member state to run in terms of pandemic preparedness. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I've been following your YouTube channel on and off, so it's quite interesting. I'm glad that you contacted me. Yeah, I mean, I was pretty astounded actually when I first heard about this pandemic treaty. I picked it up on social media. I didn't see anything in the mainstream media, nothing from the government. Even, working as one of an organizer and teacher on the medical program here, we didn't hear anything about it from official channels. So when I saw there was an opportunity to present, I kind of just grabbed it and sent in my name and affiliation. And I don't know if it's because I'm in Umeå University, where Tedros, who's the general director of the WHO, did his master's thesis a long time ago, if that actually got me in there. But whatever it was, I was glad to be selected. So I took my 2 minutes. It was a very short time to speak, and there wasn't much time to prepare, so I kind of hurried together my response. But I really did it not just professionally, because Umeå, we are a long way north. We're very dependent on international contacts, as are all universities and all researchers. So I think this kind of globalist power grab, essentially, which what it seems to me is potentially extremely damaging, not just on the country level, but also from the level of a functioning society. So that was really why I decided to speak up.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. It's quite unusual, though, to find someone in the medical profession that is prepared to speak so bluntly, I guess, about this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll just qualify that by saying I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a PhD, although I do work and teach on the medical program. I've been working in research now for the past 30 years, since I did my PhD in the UK, and then I moved to Sweden in 2008. I worked in London for 14 years at various institutes, including the Medical Research Council, which was one of the preeminent research centres in the UK. And then I was in Stanford for a year in the US. So I've had a kind of global perspective on research, as anyone does that works at the cutting edge, I guess, of medical research these days. You can't do research on your own in your own lab, really. It is a global international network, and that's extremely important for both the kind of breadth and quality of research. So pandemic's been very tough for us. Although Sweden, the restrictions were relatively less strict than some places, we're still affected by that. So we've more or less not shut down, but things have been extremely limited for the last 2 years. So the thought of having another pandemic in the near future, which would be then regulated on a global level, is just terrifying, I think, from the perspective of just trying to carry on my research.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe unpack the sort of power grab piece a little bit. So, I mean, the thing that surprises me a little bit is that we do have these international health regulations, which have been more or less in place since the WHO got going in 1948. What's the driver now to have a treaty? I think that was, as you said, it's a bit surprising that all of a sudden some national country leaders decided, okay, that hasn't worked, we need this now, potentially a completely new instrument in the form of a treaty. Why? What would be the driver for that?
Well, I mean, I think if we stick to the reason why you would want a treaty and why you would need to, increase these international health regulations, which, as you say, were introduced, I think, 69, which was the year I was born. So, and then they went through a development after the SARS outbreak, 2002, 2004. Then they made changes to the IHR, which came into force, I think, 2007, in association pretty much with the Ebola outbreak. And then 2009 with the H1N1, then that was the first time that the response received its full application. And then I guess things have been pretty quiet for the last few years. But I mean, essentially, yeah, that's a good question. Why would you need to increase the level of governance which is already in place? Could it be adapted to current situations? Does it need to be adapted? I haven't seen a full evaluation of the guidelines, or sorry, the regulations that were in place, whether they're known to be effective or not. And I'm very much against the introduction of just new legislation against a perceived threat, which is the way these things usually go. But typically there is no threat, or the threat is, blown out of all proportion, perhaps by the media or the people that wish the new legislation to go through, either for financial gain or for, control, the ability to introduce, global governance on some level.
Yeah. I mean, what there is so far, and I just also wanted to make sure that there's been a fair bit of misreporting on another stream of activity, which was to change part of the international health regulations, which was a single amendment proposed by the US, which was not approved, but that's a sort of separate process. That was a one-off, and the treaty process is carrying on unaffected. So that there's been a bit of confusion about that.
I see. So do you think, I don't want to interview you, but do you think this, that was the, was it called Article 12, or the US proposition to give the Secretary General the ability to call a pandemic response in another country?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That was a separate stream of work. And what I've seen so far is, I think, to me, it feels like this is heading towards almost a predefined conclusion, because they've already set the voting for this treaty up at the 77th Health Assembly in 2024. So a priori, I think they've decided that there will be some kind of treaty, which also is slightly worrying, because you feel the train is already on the rails, basically.
Yeah, for me, without a shadow of a doubt, I think that when you get to this level of governance, that it's too big to fail. So, of course, the roadmap is set out before the decision is made, but I think it's essentially putting lipstick on a pig. The decision has already been made, and it's just, how do we get this policy through with a minimum amount of fuss? Yeah. And I think that's why, realistically, if you had a treaty like this, which is going to affect every person on the planet, which is the point I made in my speech, why would you need to do it in secret? Why would you not publicize it so that every person involved could have their say, and to make it as effective as possible? So, coming back to your original question, no, I don't think governance on this level will ever work for a thing as complicated as a pandemic or a widespread infection, because the Earth is an enormous complex system with many different countries, populations, climate, behavior, and therefore to try and legislate for that, if it's only based on health, and in order to stop that disease from spreading and save as many lives as possible, you can't do it on this level. It's just too complicated.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that Professor Bhakti said, you know, that you can't panic all around Europe based on what's happening, for example, in Bergamo. And he went through all of those unique conditions there that led to that situation. And you can't extrapolate that then everywhere else. And I guess if you're doing it globally, it becomes, as you said, impossible with different age profiles of populations, healthcare capacity, behaviors. I mean, there's so many moving parts. I can't see how you could have one size or even two sizes fits, or three even.
No, and essentially you're trying to war game a situation which you have no appreciation for. I mean, every pathogen will be different, even if that pathogen was under laboratory conditions and you could try and model. We all know how well modeling worked for COVID-19 pandemic, and in general, modeling doesn't work very well either. I mean, I think the model is usually set up to model things that you expect, and when things don't go as you expect, the model just falls apart. And we saw that with the Imperial College modeling for COVID-19 deaths.
Yeah.
It was miles off,
Yeah.
thankfully.
Yeah.
But it still sculpted the entire response, which then has, I mean, if we look at COVID-19, then look at the effect it's had on children globally. It's horrific, and none of that has actually been factored into the cost of the response. So to think that we should then repeat that and put that in the hands of the people that essentially drove us down this pathway that we've had for the last 2 or 3 years is pretty terrifying, actually.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, it means that things like Sweden just won't be possible, because you'll have your instructions from Geneva, and this is what we're going to do, and that's it, basically. And if you, as you said, if you make a mistake, the consequences then are global and just, I mean, jaw-droppingly bad.
Yeah, and I really had the benefit of, you know, being British, sitting in northern Sweden, watching the pandemic unfold. It was almost like watching a train crash from afar, but, you know, you could see what was happening in Europe, in Italy, in the UK. And actually the first time, because we were quite in the depths of winter when COVID struck and started to spread, when Swedish schools have a half term in March, and Stockholm and southern Sweden have the holiday in week 8, which is like the first week of March, and then in northern Sweden we have week 9, which is the week after. And I said to my wife, you know, watch when everyone goes away for their ski holidays, week 8 from Stockholm, etc. That's when it's going to get to Sweden in big numbers, and then we'll get it a week later when we start to mix with those people. And sure enough, that's when it hit hard in Västerbotten, which is the county I'm in. But, you know, essentially in Sweden, it was a very special situation. There was about 3,000 elderly people that should have died the year before, but they didn't, because it was a very unusually warm summer, an Indian summer in many ways. And I suspect that's got something to do with vitamin D levels, that people were had high levels of vitamin D, and that the normal seasonal influenza didn't hit as hard as it usually does for every year. You know, before that, you seem to see a very similar pattern in deaths through the winter months. So 2018-19, that didn't happen. So you had this 3,000 people that were in elderly care homes or being looked after at home by home carers that would drive from house to house. And that was essentially the 3,000 deaths that happened during 1920, were those people that were generally infirm, had a lot of comorbidities, you know, unfortunate that it happened, but not unusual and not inexplicable either. And then each year after that, there has been no, increase in deaths. It was just those 3,000 extra people essentially that got COVID and died.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, you see different local differences in Sweden. Västerbotten had very low cases relative to other parts. And then we had a later kind of in the second or third wave, we ended up with a large number of cases, but not many hospitalizations or deaths. So even on a national level, you see differences from region to region. How could you cover that with a one size fits all? I just don't see it. In contrast, though, if you had a local system where local experts that were recognizing local infections and documenting them and sending them up to kind of a central organization that could collate that information, that would be efficient and also effective.
Yeah, I think everybody, it seems, agrees with the surveillance aspect of this treaty. You know, the surveillance, passing out information on pathogens, that all makes sense, maybe issuing recommendations. But as it starts to move more and more into instructions on pandemic responses where the big questions are.
Yeah, and then you have a situation where the WHO is essentially funded by national stakeholders, but also organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, by Gavi.
Gavi, yeah.
So you have a situation where the fox is running the hen house. You know, the person who invests in the vaccines is both involved in funding the organization that calls when there's a pandemic and whether vaccines should be deployed, and that will feed back to the financial interests of the people funding it in the first place. If this was a company, it would never be allowed.
Yeah. I mean, that to me seems really obvious, but the UN sort of language around this is the public-private partnership is great, but it's so obvious to an outsider that there's conflicts of interest involved when there's money, and even if it in the form of philanthropy, there's agendas coming in, and it's no longer a sort of purely democratic process at that point.
No, and if you're honest, if you've done your homework about how COVID-19 vaccines became approved, essentially were rushed through without proper regulation or checks, and serious questions over whether the trials were done in a honest, so how I just don't see how you can't see that this is there's a very good Swedish word called jäv, which means you have some kind of bias, either because you're a relationship or so forth. But it's just not.
Yeah, and how? I mean, do you get a feeling for other medical professionals who are also against this? As you said, the consultation was done with about 5 minutes notice, and again, it's those same stakeholders, Gavi, feeding into the consultation, although they're doing business with the WHO. Is there actually a possibility for, real medical expertise to stand up and say, well, actually, we're not really in favor of this?
Well, there are several problems. I mean, obviously, as you said, I'm quite vocal, and that's more or less I made the conscious decision. I mean, you can't keep quiet about this because this is going in a very, very dangerous direction, and I see where it's heading. How do I know that? I don't know. I just have a feeling, and for me, it's obvious. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it again. It's a bit like a magic eye picture.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when I talk to colleagues, generally they're either not interested or they're not aware of it at all. And then there's also a proportion of people that don't want to speak out because they fear for their jobs or their livelihoods. And I think particularly in the medical profession, that is true. I mean, I know doctors that know of serious side effects. They know that the vaccination has not been a necessarily good idea for all people. I mean, that there will be people that vaccination is perhaps advisable for, but they just won't speak out because they don't want to lose their job. Or then you have the other situation where people take a vaccination, just because they want to travel. They think this is easy for me. And because we've been told from up above that this is safe and effective and we should all take it, then we'll do it, because they wouldn't lie to us. But I know a lot of people that have had side effects, and I know a lot of people that know other people that have had side effects, and it's not as simple as that.
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you is, one of the main bits of evidence in this process is an independent panel. I think it's called actually, I've got it here, Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness. And I looked at that independent panel, and from the 13 people on the panel, 9 of them are either ex-WHO UN employees, or they've been funded by UN in some shape or form. And there are also, I think, I don't want to get this wrong, but from the 13, I think 9 have no medical background whatsoever. So it's, and that kind of really makes me nervous, because that panel has a lot of weight, their reports, and their reports also, they seem to be feeding into a lot of those things that went wrong. You see that word vaccine coming up a lot, better to be safe than sorry, preemptive lockdowns. And then, as you said, a bit of reliance on models going in early. That also causes me a lot of problem. There's really, firstly, it's the affiliation with the sort of UN family, and then it's the lack of medical knowledge in that group. I mean, it's not even close to half of the people with medical expertise. It's mainly politicians making pandemic preparedness recommendations, which is, I don't know if that's such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a scientist, as someone who's kind of dedicated their life to trying to understand the truth and trying to understand the complexity of biological systems in order to help people that have diseases of one sort or another. I mean, that's what I do. I just can't follow anything that isn't based on evidence, and the evidence is, both open, properly presented, and evaluated in a balanced way, taking into account both strengths and weaknesses of the experimental design and the way the data was gathered and the way that it's been analyzed. I mean, that's how I've been trained, and that's what I've strived to become, an expert at my whole life. And I don't think you ever get to the end of that. It's a process it's a repeating process. So whenever you set up these kind of panels, there's always bias in who is selected. But when you essentially do it behind closed doors and provide an expert review panel where those reviews are never put out in public, I think is a serious question mark around that. And at least in science over the last 10, 15 years, with open publication and new approaches to publishing results and data, that things have become much more open and transparent than they used to be. And it seems that when we go up to the hierarchy of global health, that's been reversed. So I used to hold the WHO in very high esteem, even a couple of years ago, pre-2019. And when I saw how essentially WHO was politicized, if you think to the way that Taiwan was alerting to the fact that there was a serious infections of COVID that needed to be responded to, and the WHO didn't really take that seriously, I guess, because of China's effect on them. That started to raise alarm bells for me. And now when I look at it more closely, I mean, I don't see anything transparent or honest about the whole setup. We are moving now towards the weaponization of health, the introduction of digital identification system, and you can see how vaccination, or at least a very close contact of a person with the vaccine passport system every year, would be very useful for maintaining digital identity databases, which are going to then be used for the rollout of digital currencies, etc., etc. And for me, this is just another part in the whole globalization model, which is being run out ahead of time. Thankfully, we have a little bit of insight into it now. More and more people are realizing that this is not all about health. Is it too little too late? I'm not really sure, but I don't think ultimately this will succeed. You know, the idea that you could bring in a layer of global governance without people really voting for it. But what it's going to do ultimately is destroy Western civilization. I have no doubt about that. We're in the kind of final stages of the peak of Western civilization, at least for this round. And we're looking at a colossal crash, just because of loss of truth, loss of reality. We're not making decisions now based on real world data that will make a difference to people. Decisions are being made based on, you know, ideas, concepts, thoughts that we can have a perfect society if we can only track, follow, analyze, and control every aspect of that. And that's not how biological systems work.
Yeah, it's a sort of utopian technocracy is the way I look at it. Yeah, and as you said, the digital aspects of that are also included in, it's something called a zero draft, which is one of the working groups has already come up with some suggestions for changing those health regulations, and that references access to private sector, you know, public-private cooperation in the electronic vaccine passports, in the access to data about individuals, and you know, there's that whole agenda is opening up there basically. And I agree with you. I mean, it's like all of these things. It could be useful, but it also could be dangerous depending on how it's used. And now more people are aware of the sort of dual use of this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that if we required, you know, stronger laws and treaties in order to protect our health, then that would be based on evidence. If it's political, then what will happen is that, you know, those powers and treaties will be requested based on the projected fear of something that was going to affect us in the future that we should all worry about. Like I haven't really seen any. It's too early, I guess, to have a clear evaluation of COVID-19 and how effective the vaccination program was. But there is data available for the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic. The Swedish Läkemedelsverket, which is the medical products agency in Sweden, evaluated that 2013, I think, and they have published a document on that. And what was kind of interesting, I thought, was that so in Europe, there were something like 30 million doses of pandemics given. 5.5 million of those are in Sweden. So Swedes are very good at rolling up their arm and sleeve and saying, yes, please vaccinate me when the government says you should do this. So for Läkemedelsverket evaluation, they estimated that I think 100 lives were saved based on that 5.5 million doses, and 200 people were prevented from going into A&E or hospitalization. But the cost was 440 people, mainly young people, that all got narcolepsy.
Yeah.
So for me, that was an absolute failure. I mean, you created 446 young people and you saved potentially 100 lives. And what the cost of the vaccination program is, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Now, I'd love to see the same kind of health economy done on COVID-19 vaccinations to see what the real saving for that, you know, program was.
Well, I mean, we've done some work on all-cause mortality, and it doesn't look too convincing, I have to say. With Professor Fenton has done a lot on this, so yeah, it's not very inspiring, to be honest. So
yeah. I can provide a link to that document if you want it. It's in Swedish, I think. I'm not sure if there's an English translation.
Well, I'll have a look. Yeah, I'll put it through the translate. So how do we go from here? I think you're right that this is really very, very important, this treaty. And although it's in theory open to consultation, as you said, it was all a little bit last minute. You've got 2 minutes each. You were lucky to get selected. And I also get the feeling that most of the experts around this process are insiders, so they have some kind of interest in seeing this pushed forward. How do the people who are more concerned about this have a voice to stop it, or at least to get that voice heard and raise some really serious concerns?
Yeah, well, I think there's several levels. I mean, but the first thing is not to remain silent. I think as soon as we stop talking about this and don't do anything, then the problem gets worse. I think, that's why, I mean, and that's my motivation for speaking to you. I mean, there are many people, I think, colleagues of mine and people that, don't believe in conspiracy theories, and this is a real conspiracy. It's not just a aliens or a strange conspiracy. This is happening, and there's plenty of evidence to show this is happening. To turn a blind eye to that, I think, is terrible. It's just going to create a bigger problem down the road. So talking about it is very important. Getting as much into the media as possible is very important. At least there can be a more open discussion about it there. But this is very difficult because it's being censored on a massive level. On both social media and newspapers aren't publishing these kind of things. Writing to MPs, getting your local representatives involved and at least airing views, I think is really important. And I've tried to do that. So the more people that do, the better. And I think there is often a reticence that people think, well, it won't make any difference if I write, but it does. It really does have an effect. I don't think the WHO would have got the kickback that they receive this time if it wasn't for the enormous efforts of people on social media to spread information about the pandemic treaty and this open debate that was, although it was short, it was there.
Yeah.
A few of us got on there and got our words out. And I have received a few emails actually from people that thanked me for doing that, which was very nice.
Yeah,
so
no, I think you did a great job. Well done for getting on there. It does make a difference. I think, funnily enough, for me, I think it might be the emerging market countries that actually might put a stop to this, because I think they, for many reasons, are nervous about sort of central control coming out of somewhere like Geneva, telling them what to do on their own health policies. And it may well be that part of the world will actually not allow this to happen, essentially.
Yeah, and at least from a human perspective, Alex, this is, for me, is horrific. You have people where their biggest problem is putting food on the table and clean water in their glasses on a daily basis. And we're going to go now into a period of very extreme food shortages. This is not new. I mean, many people are speaking about it, and you can see that problem unfolding, and it's going to be low middle income countries that are hit the hardest. The biggest problems in the world are not, for example, COVID or whatever latest pandemic comes next, monkeypox or whatever. These are not the biggest communicable diseases. The biggest problem, in my mind, these are political tools that are being used to sculpt us towards a particular future that I'm not willing to live in, put it that way. So the other thing then is just say no, to reject these various non-democratic policies that come down from above, and quite simply ignore them.
Yeah.
As much as we can.
Yeah. Good. Well, on that happy note, I think, Jonathan, I'd like to thank you for spending the time today, and also, as I said, for actually getting organized to get into that 2-minute video at the WHO. And I'm glad people wrote to you and appreciated the efforts that you made there. And I think this is far from over. I think it may not go exactly the way that the architects of this process have intended. And fingers crossed, we'll raise valid concerns and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Good. All right. Thanks very much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay.